Hey everyone, Michelle here from michellesmidheaven.com, and today I'm sharing some of my thoughts on one of the major ingresses of the year, Saturn in Aries. Saturn, the god of death, opposition, negation, and rejection, is leaving Pisces behind and moving into Aries. And that means that instead of working with Jupiter, who is the god of law, ideology, and collective vision, Saturn is now going to work very closely together with Mars. And that also means that Saturn is going to interfere with Mars's business and all the topics that Aries represents. So, what does that look like? Instead of examining and interrogating collective Piscean dreams of big ideas and ideologies, Saturn will now confront our personal will because planets in Aries express individualism and Saturn stirs and disrupts whatever is going on there for you. We're moving from an era that challenged collective ideals and institutional belief systems to an era that is going to test the boundaries of personal freedom and autonomy. Saturn in Pisces opposed any bloated ideologies, any big ideas, and disrupted Jupiterian unity. And you could say that Saturn was decomposing the glue that holds worldviews together. Other Piscean themes are brotherhood or simply togetherness, having a common goal as a community. Saturn disbanded all of that, and now Saturn in Aries is going to turn his gaze toward the individual self. One thing that I want to point out that people often forget about is that before Uranus was discovered, Saturn was actually associated with rebellion because Saturn is the god of opposition. His signs, Capricorn and Aquarius, oppose the signs of the sun and the moon, the luminaries. So Saturn represents the darkness. Saturn is always the one who is opposing the system, corrupting the existing state of affairs, whatever those are at the moment. Saturn's ingress into Aries means that Saturn is now going to have to cooperate with Mars because Mars is receiving Saturn as a guest in his fiery home of Aries, and Saturn will have to adapt to the fast tempo and impulsive drives of Aries. Now, we can think of the traits that they both have in common and things that really set them apart so we can get a picture of what to expect. One thing Mars and Saturn have in common is that they are both breakers of reality. In ancient astrology, they were called malefics, not because they are evil, but because they force change. They shake things up and make things happen, often through crisis or conflict, so that we then have to use our free will to react and respond to that crisis. A good crisis clears the path for something new and hopefully for an improvement as well. Both Mars and Saturn are here to remove obstacles for us, but they do it in drastically different ways. Mars removes barriers by sheer force or impulsive action or direct confrontation and engaging in competition in the broadest sense of the word, but he can definitely also burn bridges. We can think of sudden shifts, radical decisions, bold new projects, or any passionate pursuits that can sometimes become an obsession because there can be such an intense focus on this one single thing. Saturn, on the other hand, removes obstacles by imposing limits through delays and oftentimes denial. Saturn simply says no to things, stops things from happening. Think of doors closing, systems locking down, and long-term strategy through resistance. And if we do get to move forward or it looks like we're making some progress, there's a heaviness to it. It's hard, it's challenging, it kills the joy, and Saturn oftentimes lets us fail. A good Saturnian idea to keep in mind is that the road to success is built on failure. We get to learn from our mistakes when Saturn is around, but if we don't give up and keep working on it, we can achieve great things. The biggest difference between Mars and Saturn is probably their tempo. Mars charges while Saturn waits. Mars acts first and thinks later or starts over very quickly. Saturn often scrutinizes until it's too late. But if they work well together, they can build with a lot of precision, consistency, and courage. But some friction is inevitable. Saturn really hates to be rushed, and his host Mars simply doesn't want to wait. Mars is noise, Saturn is silence. Mars is energy, Saturn is rest. And we actually already had a taste of what's to come. The current lunar cycle we're in, that started with the new moon in Taurus, is the cycle in which the Saturn ingress is happening, right? And that's significant. The start of a cycle is like an omen or a premonition. So this cycle started off with a mass power outage in Spain. Saturn literally saying no to martial energy, electricity. That could certainly manifest as a power outage. I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to hear more about things not working as they're supposed to. People mostly think of air signs representing technology, but fire signs are also important because fire is about production. It's about the ability to make stuff. So that's another thing Saturn could bring to a halt. But usually Mars and Saturn work well together. We know that because Mars is said to be exalted in Saturn's sign of Capricorn. Mars receives earthy tools from Saturn there to build something solid, to come up with long-lasting solutions to problems. But in Aries, their cooperation is much more challenging, and there are several reasons for that. Saturn really struggles to find stable footing in Mars's fast-paced, fiery world, where decisions need to be made quickly. Saturn is very reluctant to act. And if Saturn is forced to do so, we sometimes get to see either a more clumsy or a manipulative and sometimes even cruel Saturn. Remember, Aries also happens to be the sign opposite Libra, which is where Saturn is exalted. In Libra, Saturn weighs contradictions and navigates paradoxes and conundrums with a lot of patience and elegance. In Aries, there's simply no time for that. There's no time to weigh all the pros and cons. It's act now, ask later. If we don't know what the right thing would be to do, we're just going to make something up and see what happens along the way. Now, speaking of exaltation, we can also bring in the exaltation ruler of Aries because that's another planet Saturn will be challenging. The sun is the exaltation ruler of Aries. Through the solar ability to see and judge what is going on in the present moment, Aries is a sign of lucid autonomy. But again, the sun is Saturn's nemesis, light versus dark. So Saturn in Aries finds himself in the enemy's domain. Now, one important trait is that both Mars and the Sun are associated with authority. Mars asserts his individual willpower, and the Sun represents divine authority. But Saturn is an outsider who's always in favor of the underdog. Saturn absolutely hates authority and rejects hierarchies. Saturn always prefers to operate from the margins, from the shadows, or of course from a place of opposition. So this transit is likely to provoke strong discontent with authority. And as a consequence, we might get to see how outsiders may be elevated as necessary rebels and visionaries. We might see heroes who are not your mainstream popular types, but we also might see new forms of cruelty, where some people pioneer in terms of doing an evil that was unfathomable before. Now, Saturn often likes to complain, but doesn't necessarily offer better alternatives, not straight away in any case. Saturn often rejects whatever is present now before knowing what could be done to improve the situation. It's because Saturn has to remove obstacles first, and then afterwards, when the path is cleared, then very slowly we can start thinking about a new way to move forward. But again, there's not going to be any room for patience. So we're going to have to stumble through it somehow. So Saturn in Aries ushers in a period of trial and error. New paths are started and then abandoned. Old patterns may be forcefully shut down. You can think of Saturn being overwhelmed, much like a quiet, wise old person trying to meditate or read a book on a battlefield. And Mars is going to pick up on Saturn's discomfort and fears. Fear can definitely be something lots of people could struggle with, as well as repressed anger that then has to find an outlet sooner or later. Now, if we look at the last two times Saturn traveled through Aries, they were periods of what we could call individual rebellion. Between 1967 and 1969, the counterculture exploded through psychedelics. And in this context, we can think of a personal pioneering inner journey through psychedelics, making people think differently about the material world. Matter, reality, these are words that both Mars and Saturn are concerned with. Together, they bring very concrete practical changes in the material world. And there was, of course, also the ongoing revolt against the military industrial order. The anti war protests started years earlier, but really peaked in early 1968. So here's our great rebellion against authority, against the political order of the day. From a more symbolic perspective, Saturn was rebelling against existential containment. And this was obvious among many other expressions as the rebellion against the traditional role of women, for example. And then 29 years later, Saturn in Aries arrived along with the dot-com boom, or what I think we used to call the internet bubble back then. Now, this showed a fascinating side of Saturn in Aries. I remember it was a time of ginormous optimism. Life started moving faster. There was the rise of cyber individualism, you could say, and Saturn's rebellion came through making websites, through cold and rational coding. It was the time that the internet became more and more commercialized, so it was no longer an information network between universities as it had been before. Now it was widely available to individuals. And I should add that Jupiter was moving through Saturn's signs at the time, which brings the expansion of the internet. But Saturn played a big role by bringing the theme of the lone hacker into existence, where alternative information was shared, information that opposed the mainstream narrative. Virtual reality became a thing. The Saturnian detachment from the tangible world, you could say. And you'll notice how Saturn is always peeling off layers of what we think is real. It was a very exciting time, but there were certainly also more concerns about privacy around that time. And so we see Mars Saturn as an intrusive and sometimes extremist force as well. Now, these big transits don't happen in a vacuum, and we cannot think of this particular ingress of Saturn in Aries without mentioning the presence of Neptune there, because that does give a collective dimension to this rebellion. The Saturn-Neptune combination makes things a little more magical and imaginative. I expect lots of stories about making the impossible real somehow. I think, for example, of some kind of mass enchantment by charismatic outsiders. Some of these outsiders or outcasts from society might be true pioneers and visionaries, while others, of course, might be crazy sociopaths. On a more personal level, it might be about putting in lots of effort and maybe making sacrifices for something that turns out to be an illusion. It's all about being captivated or spellbound by imaginary things. But it doesn't have to be negative. Imagination is such an extremely powerful tool, and we're bound to discover things about ourselves, about the reality we live in that we didn't know yet. Things that were totally nuts yesterday can be real tomorrow. So, how to make sense of all of this? How to make sense of this transit in your natal chart? Wherever Aries is in your chart is where Saturn will be knocking on your door. Now, Saturn is not visiting that place in your chart to bring fun times and inspiration, at least not straight away. First, Saturn will need to remove what's in the way. If you've been neglecting, avoiding, or ignoring something in the house Aries is in, Saturn will let you know. Saturn always shows us the consequences of our actions and teaches us something about the importance of humility. And take a look where your natal Mars is located in the birth chart. Keep in mind that whatever Mars represents in your natal chart are all going to be topics and themes that attract a lot of focus, energy, activity, passion, competition, conflict. And these themes will now be activated by Saturn's refining, but oftentimes frustrating presence, calling you to be more serious about all these martial topics. Saturn can offer an incredible depth to Mars's activities. So get real about them. Grow up, be mature, and take responsibility. That's what Saturn is telling us. Another placement you can take into account is your natal Saturn. Wherever Saturn is in your chart, you'll notice that those topics have the tendency to develop very slowly, or there's some disappointment there. And if that's the case, Saturn's transit through Aries is going to pick up some of that typical Mars energy that can make pivotal breakthroughs. You can take it a step further and see which houses Saturn rules in your chart and pull in those topics as well. And if Saturn happens to rule your ascendant, so if you're a Capricorn or Aquarius rising, this transit is intensely personal. It can really feel like a test of self direction or a test of self agency. Saturn in Aries ultimately demands self responsibility. You're on your own. You have got to find a way to do everything yourself. And I don't mean this in a nihilistic sense. I think Saturn is working here toward the profound realization that no one can make your choices for you. You can use this time and this Saturnian quality to consciously distance yourself from impulsive reactivity. A great exercise you can try is to imagine stepping outside of yourself to witness your situation as a third party. Take a good, honest look at it. Saturn brings the wisdom to pause. Mars then brings the will to act. Okay, so this initial pause is really Saturn's gift in Aries. And if we respond wisely to the cooperation between Mars and Saturn, we can cultivate a capacity to not charge into every fire, but to hold back just long enough to see where the flames are actually coming from. And then make use of Aries fire to forge more sustainable solutions. And can I recommend a more personal approach? If you want to know what Saturn has in store for you personally, just book a reading with me. You can do that by contacting me through my website, michelsmidheaven.com. If you liked this video, please let me know by giving it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more content. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.